So, Tommy Robinson, he's easily one of the most controversial figures in the UK, right? Well, in a recent, really in depth interview, he laid out the personal story that he says defines everything about him. In this explainer, we're going to unpack that narrative. And look, our job here isn't to take a side or to judge, but to simply understand the argument he's making from his point of view. So, let's get into it.
Okay, so his whole case, the entire argument he makes, really boils down to one single idea. To get him, you first have to get his story. He's insistent that his public persona, all the controversy, it's a direct result of what he's personally lived through. And he really frames this whole thing as a direct challenge, not just to the person interviewing him, but to you, to everyone watching. He's basically saying, listen to what I went through, and then you can judge. It's his way of asking you to see the world through his eyes before you make up your mind. So where does this all begin? What's the starting point for his story? Well, according to him, everything, and I mean everything, his entire worldview, what drives him, it all comes back to one single place. And that place is his hometown of Luton. Now, in his telling, Luton isn't just, some backdrop, it's Exhibit A. The changes he says he saw there with his own eyes, that's the bedrock for his entire political identity. All right, so let's dig into the story he tells about Luton. He really paints this picture of a town that was just completely transformed, all within his own lifetime. He throws out some pretty stark numbers to make his case. He says, look, when he was born back in 1982, Luton had just one mosque. Fast forward to today, and he claims that number is 45. He also alleges the population is getting close to 50% Pakistani Muslim. For him, this wasn't just some abstract demographic shift. It was the spark for all the conflict that followed. And then he zooms out. He tries to connect these local changes to, global terrorism. He brings up the 7/7 bomb plot materials being picked up in Luton. He points out that the Stockholm bomber came from Luton, and even makes this claim that the CIA itself identified the town as a kind of European planning hub for terror attacks. So in his narrative, his small hometown suddenly becomes this infamous spot on the world map. Okay, but what did all this actually feel like for him, personally? This is where he shifts from those big kind of abstract claims to the day-to-day reality he says he lived. And here, he makes a really crucial distinction. He's absolutely adamant that the problem was not race. He says he grew up with friends from all backgrounds, never saw racial tension. No, for him, the real division, the real fault line, was religion, a deep split between the Muslim and the non-Muslim communities. And he uses his own experiences to back this up. He talks about being targeted by what he describes as Pakistani gangs, getting robbed and being called names like Dirty Gwala or White Boy. To him, these weren't just random acts of crime. They were proof of this religiously motivated hostility he's talking about. And this division, he claims, actually became a physical reality in his own high school. He describes this informal segregation, a Muslim playground on one side of the yard and a non-Muslim playground on the other. It's a really powerful image he uses to argue that this divide was just an unavoidable part of his daily life growing up. So this all leads to the big question, right? How does he connect this backstory, everything that happened in Luton, to his very controversial public platform? This is where he really starts to build his justification. So naturally, the interviewer puts the obvious critique to him. Does he ever worry that his own, often aggressive behavior actually hurts the very message he's trying to get across? And his answer? It's just 2 words. I had no option. That's it. It's an absolute statement. In his mind, his actions weren't a choice he made, but an inevitable, necessary reaction to the story he just laid out. From there, he makes what is probably his most provocative move in the whole interview. They're talking about new hate speech laws, and he literally holds up a copy of the Quran and says this. And this is where he makes that really controversial comparison. He presents his own analysis, and we have to be clear, this is his analysis, where he claims the Quran contains about 7% hate content. And then he puts that number right next to Hitler's Mein Kampf, which he puts at 11%. By drawing this parallel, he's basically making the argument that if you're going to condemn one for hate speech, then his logic says you have to condemn the other. All right, so finally, what's the one thing he wants people, especially his critics, to get from his story? Well, it all boils down to how he sees himself in this whole picture. So how does he frame his own role? He says, look, I'm not some prophet with a crystal ball. He believes he was simply, and this is his phrase, a decade ahead of everyone else. Why? Because he thinks he saw the country's future by watching what happened to his hometown first.
So when the interviewer asks him, what's the one thing you wish your critics understood? His answer really brings it all full circle. It's that link, that unbreakable line he draws from his personal story in Luton to his public actions today.
In the end, what we're left with is this: a narrative where one man's personal experience is laid out as the complete justification for a public message. He presents his case, his evidence, and then circles back to that first challenge he laid down. What would you have done? The story is presented, the connections are made, and it's left for you to weigh if that personal story really justifies the public message.